I'm Megan Stevens from eatbeautiful.net, and we are going to be talking today about bone broth. For those of you who have read my blog for a little while, you may have already read my post on this subject, and if so, a lot of this may be redundant. I hope not so much, but I feel like it's a really important topic, especially because of the fat rancidity issue. It takes 25 minutes to cook. Great, not bad. And so for whoever happens to see this later on YouTube, or anybody who starts reading my blog in the future, this is really a topic I don't want to miss, and so I'm going to circle back and focus on it. For those of you who saw, thank you for sharing on Twitter, V. Henry. For those of you who saw my tour of our cafe, you got to see our little metal cook room, which is a whole room dedicated to cooking. It's got a really big convection oven, and then it has a huge crock pot that we make really large volumes of bone broth in. And so that's one of the main specialties of our cafe, and it's allowed me to make a lot of bone broth over the last, I would say, 3 years in bulk. But then since we've been on the GAPS diet for now over 5 years, we've been making it for about 5 years. And I made a really important mistake for the first 2 to 3 years. And so that's the mistake I want to share with you today, as well as just bone broth basics. You are more than welcome. Please ask questions along the way as you have them, or contribute comments, and we'll get started. Okay, so today I have with me some grass-fed marrow bones, which is one of my favorite ways to make bone broth. I love marrow bone broth. I also love chicken bone broth, and I love chicken feet bone broth, and the others are all good. I like them all, but those are my favorites. And we make bone broth from bone marrow at our shop, and then we harvest the bone marrow. I had a question yesterday from a reader, what to do with the bone marrow, because not everybody loves eating it by itself. I do actually love it for breakfast in a really fresh, high-fat broth with poached eggs, and have some of the marrow in there and just eat it with a spoon. It's really, really special and like deluxe, just high-fat, and it feels very nourishing. But I understand that not everybody will feel drawn to that. My kids would think it was disgusting. They don't join with me on that feast. So the thing to do with the marrow, if you're not interested in eating it by itself, is actually to puree it into your bone broth soup bases or into a stew base. And then it's just going to add richness and body, and it's just good. It's going to add to the overall goodness quality. It's going to feel more wholesome, and it's going to taste yummier. So that's a great way. I do recommend buying marrow bones if you can, because you can see all the nutrition is very accessible because the bone has been cut through. And so the collagen and minerals are easily pulled out of the bone. And also grass-fed beef is becoming more and more accessible. So you want to make sure that the grass-fed beef is made on good land where they're using sustainable practices for growing the grass. But if you can find a farmer like that, this is a nice way to make bone broth. I have here in a bag a bunch of frozen bones. These that have been holding up are cooked already. They've gone one round, and we're going to talk about the different stages of bone broth. Someone says, I love marrow bone broth. Yay. But so this is the marrow's already missing because these have gone one round. They've gone through stage one. And then this is a bag full. We buy them in 5-pound bags from our local grass-fed beef farmer. Knee-deep cattle here in Eugene, Oregon. I do too. Wonderful. So this is a bag of the frozen bones where the marrow is still intact. And I'm just going to tilt down my camera real quick so you can see the bones in the pot. There they are. So there's just a few in there, and those you can see. I don't want to pick them up right now because I don't feel like washing my hands, and it's raw meat, but there they were. And I'm going to talk about how many to use and all of that kind of thing. Okay, so let's get right down to it. If you want any of this information after we have talked, you can go to my blog, and you can go to eatbeautiful.net/bone broth. And if anyone wants to type that into the comments, that would be great. eatbeautiful.net/bone broth. And that gives you my post on this subject. Okay, so what you are going to do, and I'm going to talk about the crock pot first, and then we're going to talk about Instant Pot just briefly, because I've only looked up and kind of in my own mind made sense of what to do in the Instant Pot, but I haven't done it myself yet, but I'll give you basic times. And then we're going to talk, most importantly, what I have to contribute today is what to avoid, which most bone broth posts don't touch on this, and I think it's too important not to mention. Thank you for putting that Gap Central. Thank you. Okay, so different people have different sizes of crock pot, so you have to adjust the salt slightly depending on how big your crock pot is. Oh my goodness, hello Jen. Oh, for everyone else who's watching, this is my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, and my sister Jill are watching right now from LA. So that's so touching. I'm sending you hugs and love, Grandma Jen. All right, so depending on the size of your crock pot, different amount of bones, salt, or water, the ratio will vary slightly, and you can adjust to taste. Okay, so for a basic crock pot, which mine is really, it's an oblong one, it's quite large, but it's not much bigger than the average size round ones. Gap Central says family cooking sesh. That's right. Yes. So for that, you're going to use 1.5 pounds of bones. This doesn't have to be measured. If you have no way of weighing bones, you can eye it, and we'll talk about how much that is. It can be about the amount of bones in one chicken, and we'll talk about how that converts to beef bones. So 1.5 pounds of bones. Apple cider vinegar is, you've probably heard, a common ingredient in bone broths. I want to say here that it is entirely optional. I can't have fruit. Sometimes when people have FODMAP issues, which means they have problems with food fermenting in their gut, they are better off also not having any certain kinds of fruit, apples, which is one of which is apples. So if you can't have apple cider vinegar because you can't have apples or you can't have fruit or for whatever reason, that is totally fine. We never make our bone broth at the cafe or here at home with apple cider vinegar for that reason, for people who are sensitive. The reason apple cider vinegar is added is because it helps to pull out minerals from the bones, but I can testify that that is happening even without the apple cider vinegar. The salt is helping to do that as well. So if you want to use the apple cider vinegar, sometimes referred to as ACV, you would put in 2 tablespoons of ACV for your 1.5 pounds of bones. And then for the salt, ideally you would be getting Celtic sea salt, which you can order in bulk from Amazon.com, or just plain old sea salt is fine. This is more expensive. So this whole process is not meant to be expensive, and we can talk about sourcing of bones for that purpose too. This can be a very frugal endeavor. For those of you on healing diets who should be having bone broth every day, many times a day, you know, we have to work with our budgets. So adjustments can be made. If you can afford the Celtic sea salt, that's ideal. And then you would add 1 tablespoon plus 2 teaspoons of sea salt. Okay, and then you just fill your crock pot with water. Now, here's the most important part in the process, the instructions for how you're going to do this. And again, those ratios are on my blog at eatbeautiful.net/bone broth. Okay, so now when you go to boil the broth, what happens? The very first boil, you are going to get a lot of gelatin and a lot of fat out of your bones and any meat that happens to be on your bones, which is great. And I think one thing that also isn't discussed very often is that this high fat first stage is actually very nourishing. But what's different about my first stage than perhaps other people's instructions on how to do bone broth is that my first stage is 2 to 3 hours, or 2.5 to 3.5 hours in duration. That's it. And this is technically called a meat broth, but the thing is, it has a ton of gelatin. This first batch is actually what's going to gel, and you know, you can dump your jar upside down with the cooled broth and it's not going to come out. That's because there's so much gelatin in that first boil. You can boil or simmer, by the way. But the reason that we want to harvest at that point, when I say harvest, I mean we want to stop the process, pull out that broth or get all the fat off the top, is because we don't want that fat to go rancid. So going back to the first few years that our family was on the GAPS diet, we were making bone broth perpetually. And I'm very laid back about how I cook. I try to basically do what's easiest. And I had read the GAPS book a couple times through, knew how to make bone broth, but I had noticed that when I started a batch at night with fresh bones and went to bed, in the morning, there was a different flavor than if, for instance, I harvested the broth after a few hours for us to have mugs full or make soup with that first batch. It didn't taste good. It was the fat had kind of turned brown on the top of the broth. There was an off smell, and the flavor wasn't good, like I said. Now, I didn't know to recognize that, point at, and say, that's bad, what am I doing wrong? I just was going with the flow, never noticed anything in the GAPS book, which is written by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, that said anything differently from what I was doing. But I happened to go back for another purpose and reread the whole book. And again, this was about 2 or 3 years after we'd been on GAPS, so we'd been consuming rancid fat for a while without knowing it. So for those of you who have been doing this, don't feel badly. I mean, I think it can be gotten over, reconciled, but obviously we want to stop doing that once we realize we're doing it. But what I found in her book was that she did, it's just one place, one line, very subtle, not in the instructions on how to make bone broth. It specifically says that you don't want that first few out, you want to stop it and harvest that meat broth basically, and that if you keep cooking that fat, it will turn rancid. And it was this totally wonderful aha moment for me, because I thought back to that off smell and that off flavor, and I realized what had been causing it. So the solution is this: after about 3 hours, and when I say 3 hours, I mean first bring your broth up to temperature till it's really steaming or just simmering. From that point on is when you measure the time duration. So from 2.5 to 3.5 hours after you see that first heavy steam or the simmer begins, you go ahead and you either take a measuring cup or some kind of ladle and you spoon off all the fat off the top. And when I say all the fat, these are just clear droplets of liquid that are oil. They look like oil floating on water. Someone says, ah, great. And save them. This is good fat. This fat has not gone rancid. Put them aside. If you put it in the fridge, it will congeal and you can cook with it. If it's chicken, it's called schmaltz. If it's beef, then it's tallow. And there might be a little bit of broth that sinks to the bottom, but the fat will rise, so you will be able to harvest it and cook with it. Anyways, you want to keep it because it's nourishing. You can also puree it into soup bases, which is very healthy and makes it so much more delicious. Someone says this is so helpful. I'm so glad. So this is one method, is to harvest the fat off, and you have to be a little bit patient and steady. Just keep going and going and going. Thank you for sharing on Twitter. Just keep scooping and scooping and scooping until really you've gotten through probably 1/3 of your overall broth quantity was fat or very fatty broth. Okay, and that can go in the fridge. Then you just add a bit more water to top it off and go ahead and go for your next stage, which we'll talk about in a second. That's option one. Option two is to just go ahead and drain off all of that broth. Pour it through a colander, into a storage container, and go ahead and make soup with it or drink it or whatever. And that's just a wonderful, nourishing, what we call meat broth. And meat broth, like I said, it's super high in gelatin. So people think that you have to boil bones for 24 hours to get gelatin. But in reality, if you think about when you cook, say, like a whole chicken in the oven, have you ever cooked a whole chicken in the oven, or even chicken legs, and then you eat some of it, and instead of putting it away in a storage container, you put it away in what it was cooked in? What happens to all the pan juices at the bottom that look liquidy when it's hot? They gel, right? You pull that out of the fridge later on, it's completely gelatin. Well, that's coming out of the meat. So it's also an initial leakage out of the bones. So it's just encouraging, I think. Disc of yummy gelatin, I love it. Yes, yes, so much more gelatin with shorter cook time. Yes. So this first 3-hour broth is called a meat broth, and it's super nourishing, and it should be embraced, but it shouldn't continue to be boiled. Okay, so if you choose to harvest that, great. Then you simply fill up the pot again, the full pot with water, keep your bones in there, and add the same amount of salt again. And now your second batch is going to go for 24 hours. 24 hours is required now, at this point, now that we've gotten that initial fat and gelatin out, to reach the minerals and the collagen that are in the bones. These same bones can go for 72 hours, and you can get up to 3 harvests of broth out of the same bones. If during that process you want the broth to have more gelatin or to be more flavorful or rich, did you already say how long to cook the first batch? Yes, that first batch is just the 3-hour stage. So that's the one where we're just harvesting the gelatin and the fat to prevent the fat from going rancid. So then you can go, like I said, up to, you can get 3 batches out of the same batch of bones, 3 batches of broth out of the same batch of bones. But if at some point you want it to be more buttery or more flavorful, you can certainly add fresh bones in addition to the old bones. You're welcome. And that's what I'm going to do today. So these bones cooked for 3 hours, 3 hours. I then harvested the marrow. I actually have it in the fridge, and I'm going to puree it into a soup. These are going back into the crock pot. I'm going to cook them now for 24 hours, but because of what I'm going to do with them, which is that I want to drink some of the broth on its own, I'm actually adding in a few of these fresh bones, and I did that largely because I wanted to show you them also, but I just want you to know you can do that. You can kind of keep a perpetual broth going, and after these new bones create the fat, I'm just going to spoon it off the top in a few hours, and then I can keep it all going for 24, and I'll also take the marrow out. So it's very flexible. I don't know, for those of you who make kombucha, it's this concept of continual brewing, continuous brew, and I think it's easier. It makes our lives easier. So I recommend it. It's what we do. But everyone has a different lifestyle, and, you know, for some people, just harvesting their broth and putting it in the fridge, large amounts, and then cleaning the crock pot and letting it sit there works better. For those of you on healing protocols, for us, we're a family of 5, and we're consuming broth 3 times a day, every day. So we just keep that crock pot going because we can go through it. And you can also put soup in this same pot. There's different ways of, you know, turning your broth into soup to make your life easier. And that's one thing I work with my clients on, for those people who are new to healing diets, is how to make gaps easier. It's to cook in the same pot you're making broth in. So I want to give you one tip on that point, and it has to do with the vegetables. One of the most common questions I get is, can I put herbs or vegetables in my bone broth? And should I? Like, is bone broth better with vegetables? And my answer is no. Don't put vegetables into your bone broth. Don't put herbs into your bone broth. I'm not saying you can't, but I think it taints the flavor quite a bit. Good bone broth with the right amount of sea salt, which is why I give the exact ratio of salt to use, is perfect. It's a perfect, beautiful, nourishing comfort food. If you add carrots or celery or bay leaves, you are changing the flavor, and I think it muddies it. I think it muddies it and makes it taste like old, overcooked vegetables. So when do you add vegetables then? When you have the bone broth at the point you want it to be. If you're using larger bones like these, or for those of you who hunt, and we're going to circle back to this also as far as frugality, for those of you who hunt or have someone in your life who hunts, and you have a big elk bone or whatever, some big piece of bone, I agree, I don't add veggies until I make soup. Nice. That is really convenient, actually, if you're using the larger bones, because you can simply pull out one bone, and now you have a pot of broth to make soup with. This is not true with chicken, so it doesn't work with chicken. It's a pain in the neck. You have to fish out all these little bones, in which case you might as well just pour it through a colander and then put it back in. So I do like the bigger bones for that reason if you have a busy lifestyle. So let's say you have a big bone, or you've strained your chicken and you put your bones and you put your broth back in the pot. What you can do now is add whole vegetables to your pot. So what I mean is a whole or a halved peeled onion, or like 6 whole peeled onions. You can add 15 carrots, you can add celery, you can add zucchini, you can add bell peppers, whole. And this, you know, I'm a gourmet, like I'm into food tasting really good, not just being healing. So I want to assure you that this works. And the reason it works is because then you can make a bisque base for your soup. So you would, after they've cooked and they're really soft, you pull them out, let them cool, pull out some of the broth, let it cool, and then you can puree them with fresh ginger or garlic or fresh herbs and make a base that then you can put sauteed veggies and meatballs or slow cooked meat or whatever, spices, dried herbs into, and you have really an easy way of making the base more delicious. So my point is, don't add the veggies while the bones are cooking. You can actually, well, I'm confusing you. Let me be careful here. Don't add the veggies while the bones are cooking to make a good bone broth. No. But for making soup, yes. So I want to just add one clarification there. If you have big bones cooking to make bone broth and you're trying to expedite dinner and make it faster, all of those whole veggies I told you about, you can add them with the bones. But it's just a mindset of, I'm not adding this to the bone broth to make the bone broth better. I'm starting to make dinner. So yeah, if you've got big bones down there and you want to add a bunch of carrots on top just to expedite dinner, and then you're going to pull them out and puree them, that works too. And I do that all the time. You'll just pull the bones out when you're ready to make soup in that pot. Or if you don't want to make soup in that pot in another pot, that method works. Okay, so let me think about what I have forgotten. We need to talk about the Instant Pot. So I mentioned that your first cooking time when you don't want the fat to go rancid is 3 hours, about 2.5 to 3.5 hours. In an Instant Pot, it's 30 minutes. And if anyone wants to correct me, that's great. I've tried to read other people's Instant Pot bone broth guidelines and also assess it myself based on what I do. I know most people don't do that 3-hour boil. And so I just want those of you who make broth in an Instant Pot to realize you can't go the full 4 hours. You've got to stop it, protect the fat, even though it's in the Instant Pot, and then you can go again. So that first stopping time for an Instant Pot is 30 minutes, according to my research from what I can gauge. And then for those of you who have an Instant Pot and have already made bone broth in it, I think you already know this, but then it's 4 hours for each following stage. So 4 hours in the Instant Pot is about equivalent to each 24-hour stage in your crock pot. For those of you who don't make bone broth in a crock pot or an Instant Pot, I highly recommend it. Crock pots are very inexpensive and it makes your life so much easier. You don't have to think about it. You just add the water, the salt, and the bones and walk away. Come back at 3 hours, fill it up with water again when you're done, and walk away for 24 hours. Whereas if you're dealing with it on the stovetop, you have to watch it, add water that's evaporating, you have to babysit it. So if you don't have a crock pot, especially if you're on a healing diet and consuming lots of bone broth, I highly recommend getting a crock pot to simplify your life. Okay, I think I have covered all my bases. If you're not already following me, you can follow my Periscopes at @MegEatBeautiful. And if you want to watch this later, this particular video will be up within about 12 hours, sometimes 24 if it's a longer video. And my YouTube is Megan Stevens. My YouTube channel is Megan Stevens. Once again, if you want to see all of this information written down, you can go to my blog and go to eatbeautiful.net/bone broth. Okay, any other questions from anybody? Do you add more salt for the third cook? You sure do. If you cook a whole chicken for dinner, how long for the second cook? I'm not sure. Can you clarify that question? I'm not totally sure what you mean by that. Thank you, Megan. This was the best Periscope ever. Oh, I love that. Thank you. Is it better to cut big game bones into, Christy, can you post that game bones question again? Actually, I'm glad you did that because I knew there was one thing I hadn't covered, and that's it. I just wanted to mention, for those of you who are on a tight budget who can't afford to buy grass-fed beef, I just want to iterate that it would be great to ask around friends and family members who hunt to try to have them save bones. It's free. That makes your bone broth free. And those are grass-fed bones, obviously, because these are wild animals. So those are the most nourishing bones you could possibly get, unless they're grazing on some nasty pesticide farm, but let's assume they're not. Better to cut big game bones into smaller pieces like you have there. Yes, it is. And actually, I should say I do both just because we're busy. So sometimes when I'm given a big section of a bone, I will stick that whole thing in my crock pot, especially because I have this long one where longer bones will fit. But it is better if you can, if you have, you know, a skill saw or whatever kind of saw it is that can cut through bones. That would be great. And I don't know, maybe some butchers, it's possible you could take your game bones to a butcher, especially if you called ahead and say, can I pay you a small amount to cut my bones up for me? Okay, thanks. You're welcome. I'm so glad. So yeah, so definitely tap into wild game if you're short budget-wise, or if you just want the most nutritious bones and you're confident about where that person is hunting, then I would suggest definitely using the wild game and getting basically free bone broth. All right, I think that's it. Thanks for the info. I'm sorry if I didn't answer someone else's question completely. How often do you Periscope? Thanks for asking. Every single Wednesday, actually, at 10:30 Pacific time, 1:30 Eastern Standard Time, I am here. And then they are always on my YouTube channel, Megan Stevens, afterwards, if you miss one. So Thanks everybody for tuning in. I so appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful week.